Hello, subscribers and guests of our channel. Sit back and enjoy listening to our stories. Mr. Johnson sighed heavily, trying in vain to get the key into the keyhole. A few years ago, the pensioner began to have tremors in his hands. At first, it seemed fine, but then problems arose and he couldn't handle small objects. He was spilling water and tea. Buttoning his shirt up became a feat. The doctors couldn't help the old man. He retained his mental clarity, sharp vision, and good health, but he had a tremor and no one knew why. The neighbors whispered that it was all of the nerves. Burying his whole family and being left alone in his old age was very hard. Mr. Johnson had an active life in his younger years. He worked in a factory, and on weekends he helped out around the house. He helped out with renovations, car repairs, or just carrying heavy bags. Neighbors loved him, and then Mr. Johnson got married. He found a wonderful girl, modest, hardworking, and very beautiful. Everyone admired the couple and sincerely wished them happiness. Soon, their children were born. They had a son, Sammy, and a daughter, Sophie, a couple years later. With the arrival of the children, Mr. Johnson spent more time in the yard, building a treehouse for his and the neighbors' children, building a sandpit, and fixing swings. The man quickly gained the respect of local children and often invented activities for them. As the years passed, the children grew up and their pastimes changed. One day, Mr. Johnson was returning from work a little earlier than usual. He stepped out onto his street and saw a sidecar motorcycle hurling down the middle of the road. Alex, his son's best friend, was driving it, and behind him in the sidecar was the rest of the yard group. When he saw his Sammy among the boys, the man decided to tweak their ears. These 5 pranksters climbed onto the motorcycle and rode out onto the main street. Either Alex spotted his friend's dad, or he just couldn't control it. But the bike swerved and went into a tree. Good thing the young racers didn't have time to accelerate. The bike was the only casualty, and the boys were just frightened. Mr. Johnson scolded the whole bunch and said that he would tell their parents and report the matter to the police. He gave the boys a good scare and sent them home. The bike turned out to be Alex's grandfather's property. He'd been living in the country house all summer and wasn't due back in town for another month. He and Alex were the only ones who ever went into the garage. Mr. Johnson had told no one about the accident and had been quietly fixing the bike himself in the evenings. When the owner of the transport came back, he didn't even notice anything. The lads were expecting to get a kicking from their parents at first, but then they realized that Mr. Johnson wasn't going to tell them anything and calmed down. The man was held in even higher esteem, and he had the say in the matters between young people. Parents didn't have as much influence over their offspring as Mr. Johnson did. The boys matured and dispersed to different educational institutions and cities. Fate was slowly splitting them apart. Someone went to another town. Alex went to another state. And Sam, Mr. Johnson's son, went to conquer New York, and only he never came back. Parents were told the lad got mixed up in a gang war. Either he happened to be walking by, or he actually made some dangerous acquaintances. But one day in a fight, Sam got stabbed. Doctors arrived late and were unable to save the lad. Mr. Johnson refused to even think that his son might have been involved in anything criminal. But it didn't matter. It's impossible to bring a man back from the dead. The family had taken the loss of their son very badly. When Sophie told them that she also wanted to go to another city, the parents were very strongly against it. They asked their daughter to stay, but she was very strong-willed and managed to convince them. She succeeded in getting a job, and a few years later, she married and had a son. The parents were overjoyed with their daughter's success and didn't talk about their problems. Things were really bad. Mr. Johnson's wife had been diagnosed with cancer and was slowly dying. It was too late to start treatment. A couple of months later, the man buried his other half. At the time, his life revolved around his daughter and grandson. They lived far away, but called each other every day. Sophie had been promoted at work. Her husband's business was booming, and the family was traveling abroad. They were just returning from another holiday when their plane lost control. No one survived the crash. When Mr. Johnson was informed of this terrible tragedy, it seemed to him that the world had collapsed. The man had lost all of his family, all those he loved so much. The pensioner wandered aimlessly through the streets and stared blankly through passers-by. That's when the tremor started. Several years passed, and the old man's condition became worse and worse. His neighbors would occasionally help him, opening or closing the door. However, he had to wait a long time for someone on the stair landing or try to get the key into the keyhole by himself. Once a week, a social worker came to the lonely pensioner to help him clean the flat and cook food, but most of the time, Mr. Johnson spent time alone. One autumn, the old man went outside. The weather wasn't suitable for walking. There was a strong wind, and even the puddles were frozen on the cold asphalt. The elderly man needed to buy some bread. On his way back in his yard, he bumped into a man. After apologizing, Mr. Johnson wandered on. "Mr. Johnson," the man called out to him in surprise. The old man squinted his eyes and suddenly recognized the young man. "Alex, how are you? What brings you here? How are you? If you have a minute, let's go to my place. I'll make some tea." Alex agreed and frowned when he saw the pensioner's hands shaking. He opened the door himself, brewed some tea, and told him about himself and the rest of his friends from the yard. Alex regarded the furnishings of Mr. Johnson's flat with amazement. The handyman was good at any job, but the shelf was warped, the refrigerator was leaking, the window was cracked and wouldn't close. The cold autumn wind was blowing freely into the kitchen. "It's okay," the old man waved him off. "Tell me about yourself." The old acquaintances chatted until dark, and then Alex said goodbye to his best friend's father and drove across town to his home. Mr. Johnson went to bed a perfectly happy man. It had been a long time since he had such an interesting and fulfilling day and conversation with a wonderful man. More than a week passed when the doorbell rang. On the doorstep stood Alex. He informed the pensioner that they were going as a whole family to the country house for a few days and were taking Mr. Johnson with them, and no objections were accepted. "After all, someone has to teach my boys how to pick mushrooms," Alex smiled. Mr. Johnson agreed. Alex's family turned out to be wonderful. The children obeyed their new friend and were often together in forests. Alex's wife was very friendly, but Mr. Johnson didn't manage to talk to the head of the family. On the first evening, he said that he had been called to work and left. He asked the old man for the keys to his flat, supposedly to drop off some vegetables on his way. At first, he promised to go away for a while, but then he disappeared for 3 days. He came back after a long absence, took everyone into town, dropping Mr. Johnson off last. He walked him to his flat, opened the door, and the pensioner was speechless. His flat was unrecognizable. The shabby wallpaper had been replaced by new ones. Pictures and shelves were evenly hung on the walls, and the window in the kitchen had been replaced by a new one as well. "Alex, what's this?" The old man was taken aback. "Me and the guys got together, did a little bit of fiddling around," Alex said. "I remember well how you didn't say anything about us to our parents back then, and you helped me fix my bike. It's a little late for that, but I want to thank you. We all do." 3 more men came out of the living room, the same group that had been friends with his son all his childhood. Mr. Johnson burst into tears. The boys were embarrassed. He smiled and called everyone for tea. They sat over a hot drink, talking until the morning, remembering their childhood, that motorcycle adventure, telling how Alex had found them all, put them together, how they had made repairs, laughing and joking, sharing their plans for the future. And as they were leaving, one of them said, "Mr. Johnson, I have a friend in the police in New York. I asked him to find out anything about Sammy. Well, turns out he stood up for a girl, bad people got in his way, and he wasn't in any gang." "Thank you," answered the old man and smiled. Now he knew for sure that his son was the best person, and he made the same friends. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the Viral Tales channel and click on that bell icon to be notified the moment I have another story to share with you. And if you have a story to share, leave it in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.